International relations theory makes a lot more sense if you have an historical context within which to imagine it. You should know that the history you're going to be shown is extremely selective. I'm not showing you all of the historical events. I'm showing you those that are most relevant to illustrate the theories that we're going to discuss. An important starting point for the study of international relations is political geography. You need to know what the surface of the earth looks like and where the states are located. Geopolitics matters. States are important because they are the principal actors that we study in international relations. These states are not static, but are themselves the products of history. Charles Tilly, in his study of the origin of European states, observed that in 1500 Common Era, there were 500 political units in Europe. But by the early 20th century, there were merely 30. The vast majority of states were destroyed and absorbed in 4 centuries of constant warfare. Now, international relations and professional diplomatic history goes back millennia. But we are interested only in its most recent and modern form in this class. Recorded world political history goes back approximately 5,000 years to the Sumerians in Mesopotamia and the Near East, what is today referred to as the Middle East. There is on display at the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul the Treaty of Kadesh between the Hittites and the Egyptians. And you can see in that treaty almost exactly the same points that states today discuss. Border delineation, spheres of influence, client states, hostile individuals who have found refuge in the other's territory and their status, cultural exchanges, trade, strategic marriages. So international relations as a practice of a professional diplomatic corps goes back thousands of years. The shift of world power and events from the Near East had to do with a general drop in their share of the population from around 30% of the world's population down to about 5% within a millennium. A half millennium ago, Europe, whose discourse has come to dominate current international relations theory, was then an isolated peninsula in a corner of the Eurasian landmass. Demographically, however, Europe was set to have a major influence. You can see here the distribution of the world's population. There's some debate as to whether there is an underrepresentation of the populations in Central and South America, and that this population is likely the population that would have been reached after the old world diseases would have been brought by the Europeans to North and South America. But you can see that demographically, about 500 years ago, Europe was set because of developments in agriculture that supported a large population to assert itself disproportionately compared to its neighbors. You can see here in the same time period the different political units internationally. You have, of course, a great many states in Europe itself. In Africa, you had Timbuktu and the Songhai Empire, which were exporting gold and minerals. You've got the Abyssinians. In South America, you've got the Inca Empire. In Central America, the Aztec Empire. You've got various political units in the Near East and the Middle East and South Asia. And in East Asia, you've got the very large Ming Empire. And you can see the beginning in the center of the map, the expansion of the Portuguese. Europe was, through commerce and military expansion, to come to dominate much of the world over the next 500 years. starting around Common Era 1500. Europeans would gradually incorporate or bring other regions into contact with their own political system. Most of the world at this time was organized along the lines of feudal hierarchies peaked by family dynasties, some as large as empires. There were also loose religiously affiliated political groups like Christendom or Islam, and you had powerful individual commercial states. The Europeans were not the first to engage in large-scale maritime strategic operations. The Kingdom of Chola at the bottom tip of India in South Asia had a dispute with the core kingdom of Majapahit, which is in the island of Java, which is, if you look at the very bottom of the map, you'll see Srivijaya. It's the island that's to the east of Palembang that you can see on the map. The Cholans sent a fleet across the ocean, an enormous distance, and circumnavigated Java, destroying all of its ports. And the depiction of Hindu ships like those that destroyed the empire of Majapahit are depicted on the walls of a Buddhist pyramid in Java at the foothills of Mount Merapi. And the pyramid is called Borobudur, and it's visible today. Probably one of the biggest missed opportunities and turning points in history was the destruction of the fleet of Chinese eunuch Admiral Zheng He. The Ming Dynasty had dispatched his fleet in order to declare China's status as an important kingdom and thereby win tribute from the states. And the Chinese logic of tribute is not to extract resources from neighboring states, but to get the neighboring states to acknowledge that China is the center of regional politics. And this actually enhances China's domestic legitimacy. So as peculiar as it seems, the Chinese were not expanding and traveling in order to get more wealth. They were doing it so that they could make an exchange where the regional states recognized China's hegemony, and then China in turn legitimized their regimes, and then they could coordinate all variety of diplomacy. So Admiral Zheng He set off in a number of different expeditions over several decades and traveled throughout the Indian Ocean. And this is crucial because it allowed China to essentially see the maritime portion of the Silk Trade route. So goods would be manufactured in China in places like Ningpo, including consumer products, and they would be shipped along with spices from Southeast Asia to southern India, Chola and Kerala, and then they would go on into the Middle East and on into Mediterranean markets. And so China had an opportunity to set up bases and alliances. Some of these resulted in military action. The the Chinese landed Marines at what is today Sri Lanka and seized a monarch and had the monarch replaced with a leader that was more friendly to Ming interests. So this was not an entirely Pacific campaign. But the Chinese government in the Ming Dynasty decided to make a shift in both ideological and state structure. And they shifted from Buddhism, which was widely supported by the state eunuchs, to Neo-Confucianism, and a shift to government positions being held by family members as a way of reducing the type of corruption that emerges with the eunuchs. And a consequence of that was that Zheng He's fleet was destroyed. And the resources that were put to the fleet were redirected towards building the Wall of China to protect China against more immediate terrestrial threats like the Huns to the north. And this policy had long-reaching consequences because shortly thereafter, 3 decades later, the Europeans showed up in the Indian Ocean and world history changed forever. If the Chinese had not stopped these expeditions and kept them going, you probably would have seen the Chinese colonizing Australia, colonizing North America and South America, and the world would be a completely different place demographically. You can see here a comparison in the scale of the ships dispatched by the Ming Dynasty under Admiral Zheng He and the typical caravels that were being operated as trading vessels by the Portuguese. The scale of the Chinese ships reflects the economic power of the Chinese state. Although the Portuguese ships were probably more economical and more rational because they were being deployed by commercially minded royal sponsors and owners who were trying to get return on capital. And these small Portuguese vessels actually lasted, because of their durability and construction and better naval experience, they lasted much longer than the Chinese vessels. So though they were small, they hit above their weight. The key dates for the global transformation of the maritime strategic landscape occurred with the arrival of the Portuguese admiral adventurer Albuquerque and his flotilla. And he proceeded to go around the littoral of the Indian Ocean and destroy all of the competing fleets and maritime powers, ultimately securing the entrance to the Red Sea and taking over Malacca in what is today Malaysia, the Strait of Malacca, and thereby dominated the spice trade, or the maritime portion of the Silk Route that went between East Asia and Southeast Asia, through South Asia, on into the Middle East and into the Mediterranean. Since this expedition, the oceans have always been dominated by a European power or by a Western power like the United States. You can see here the quick establishment of the Portuguese and Spanish maritime factories, which are bases located on the littorals of the different oceans. And while the Portuguese and Spanish didn't conquer large parts of Africa or Asia, by taking control of intercontinental trade and inter-kingdom trade and coastal trade in some cases, they effectively took control of 5 to 10% of global commerce. So it didn't mean they took over commerce, but they could tax it because they controlled all the key ports. And that made them incredibly wealthy and powerful. And in South America, where they had strategic advantages because of proximity, and because unlike Africa, where the Spanish and Portuguese couldn't penetrate into the interior because of disease, in South America there was an epidemiologically naive population which was vulnerable to disease. And the sudden collapse of those empires gave Spain an opportunity, and Portugal in South America, what is today Brazil, to actually take over large blocks of territory. The 30 Years' War was a pivotal conflict that changed the structure of the international system in Europe and began the process of changing the international structure in the rest of the world as well. It was a war that involved 6 of the world's 7 great powers between 1618 and 1648. It was the war that started the spread of the state as an actor in the international system. And the state would later spread from Europe to other continents. The 30 Years' War started as a Protestant Catholic civil war in Germany, but it then spread to include the Catholic Holy Roman Empire, with the Spanish and Austrians on that side, fighting against the Lutheran Germans, the Swedes, and ultimately France. The brutality of the conflict killed between a quarter to a third of Germany's population, up to 8 million people. And the consequence of the unrestrained violence delegitimized the idea of Christendom, the idea that you had one continent united in one common set of beliefs and one culture. Up to that point, Christendom had united Europe as a loose political organization with significant influence from the Pope in Rome. The war was concluded by the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, which in political science is used to indicate the birth of sovereign states as we understand them, as having a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. The real change was that citizens no longer divided their loyalties between a local lord and the Pope. Instead, Europeans now concentrated their allegiance to an embodiment of the state. This could often be a monarch. Although at the same time, the English had decapitated the head of their king in 1649 and created a mixed republican parliamentary system. But this was still a state. So people would now fight and die for these new abstract associations that were disassociated from a common religious organization. You can see here on the left the portrait of Count Tilly, and on the right, Cardinal Richelieu of France, who helped organize the French war effort against the Catholic Habsburgs and Austrians. You can see here in the center of the map the Grade Inn area, which was the Catholic part of Central Europe, along with the lined part that you can see in southern Italy and Spain. And they are united in their war against the Swedes, the French, the Dutch Republic, and Protestant states in the center. And you can see those dashed lines, which are the path of Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedish general, in his fight against Wallenstein and Tilly. And here in the demography of the world of 1648, this is about 150 years later than the arrival of Albuquerque in the Indian Ocean, you can see the rise of populations globally in Europe, South Asia, and East Asia, with the difference now that Europe controlled the oceans, which at this time was dominated by the Dutch. So the fleets were going to allow the Europeans to exert themselves against foreign states, and these fleets were going to block other kingdoms from uniting and organizing against this European dominance. You can see here the political representation. The dashed lines, which are grayed in the center, are Europe and its possessions, as well as Christian kingdoms like Abyssinia, which you can see in the Horn of Africa. So you can see that aside from South America, the Europeans are not conquering much, but they've dominated the maritime trade routes, which has given them enormous power. Here you can see the battlefield itself during one period of the war. The main reason the war killed so many Germans was that the logistical systems were fairly sparse, and because the armies had fought for such a long time, they basically took food from farmers as they marched. And this went on decade after decade, and it caused enormous destruction and consequently famine in the population. On the top you can see the critical Battle of Lutzen in 1632, And you can see at the bottom and the center the two depictions of Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedish Protestant leader, who brought his very effective military formations to fight against the Catholics. And you can see Wallenstein on the bottom right, who was ultimately hired to deal with Gustavus Adolphus. Gustavus Adolphus was ultimately killed on the battlefield, and Wallenstein was murdered by the Catholics. The importance of the First World War in international relations comes from its combination of mass nationalist mobilizations. This was already present a century earlier during the Napoleonic Wars, but it combined it with the mass production of industrialization, in particularly of artillery. The scale of the destruction produced by the war delegitimized aristocratic privilege among most of the classes in most countries. It accelerated democracy and the spread of voting. And it led to the delegitimization of European empires and militarism. You can see here the location of the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. In the Central Power camp, we have the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Central Europe, and we have their ally in the Ottoman Empire, which is located in Asia Minor and the Near East. The Allies consist primarily of France, Russia, and the United Kingdom, and Italy, as well as Serbia, Romania, and Belgium, and associated other allies. You can see in this slide the spread of the Central Powers forces into the east, into Russia. But you can also see Russian forces battling the Ottoman Empire in the Caucasus region. And you can see the complicated politics of the Balkan area. And you can see that there isn't a significant change in the front lines between Germany and France, which was the largest concentration of military force during the First World War. The First World War is also interesting to scholars because there's still no agreement over what was the underlying cause of the war. Unlike the Second World War, which was almost inevitable given Adolf Hitler's stated intention to start a war, the First World War was viewed far more as an inadvertent disaster. None of the parties were overly enthusiastic at the outbreak of the conflict, but it happened anyway. And retrospectively, the conflict was a colossal disaster, resulting in the destruction of the monarchies of the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, and otherwise exhausting the resources of England, France, and Italy, and ultimately beginning the decline of European power that would lead to their replacement in the long term by the United States and the rise of the Soviet Union. One of the causes of the First World War, according to American President Wilson, was the secret alliance system. The fact that countries made promises to each other to intervene secretly, which made it difficult then to determine if the interlocking way these systems worked, whether it would cause an escalation from a local incident to a large-scale global conflict. But even in the absence of the secret alliance system, a more common criticism was that countries engaged in power politics without considering their systemic war-prone consequences. They are focused mostly on their local security. And we can see here where the circles overlap is where the powers made agreements. So we can see as early as 1879, Austria-Hungary and Germany came to common purposes. They both had issues with Russia, which had always been, at least for the previous 2 centuries, a major European power. And they tried to add to their power in Central Europe for their coalition by engaging Italy in as a common ally, and that became the Triple Alliance. Now, the Austrians and the Austro-Hungarians had a major issue with countries in the Balkans because they were in the process of expanding in that direction with the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 1910s and shortly thereafter. So Italy became an ally of Austria-Hungary and Germany. Now, the Russians and French, facing a rapidly industrializing Germany, made an alliance in 1894. And then you had an association between France and Britain, which then became the Triple Entente. So here you had 2 separate sides. Now the Russians, pursuing an ideology of pan-Slavism, essentially identity politics, uniting all Slavs together in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and the Balkans, supported Serbia. And this was an issue for the Austro-Hungarians because they had Serbians living within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, particularly in places like Vojvodina, who wanted to have their independence and incorporation into Serbia. The British and the Russians came to an arrangement in 1907, and the Germans engaged the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire had some sense that they were going to be targeted by the British and French in the Middle East. So these were the alliance associations at the start of the war. So if we follow the sequence of events, on June 28, 1914, Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian student, assassinates the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife. The Archduke was set to be the next monarch. He was a monarch in waiting to be the next emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so the Austro-Hungarian leadership felt compelled to act. And they blamed Serbia for encouraging the student-led nationalists. And so you had, on July 28th, a declaration of war, a DOW, by Austria-Hungary against Serbia. Now, the Russians mobilized, and they had a choice between full or partial mobilization. And mobilization consisted of rearranging train schedules and putting millions of people into uniforms, taking them to depots, giving them a quick refresher training, because most of these soldiers had reserve training, giving them a firearm, and then moving them to the front, plus all the logistics associated with it. So once you start one type of mobilization, it's very difficult to change paths and go to the other type of mobilization. And so the Russians had a choice between partial mobilization, which would have only focused on Austria-Hungary to essentially protect Serbia, or full mobilization, which would have also targeted Germany. And the Russians played it safe. They couldn't anticipate whether Germany was going to support Austria-Hungary or not, and so the Russians engaged in full mobilization in the event that Germany decided to assist Austria-Hungary. Now that was a threat to Germany, because here you had millions of Russian soldiers building up, moving to the frontier with Germany. Now Germany recognized that Russia's mobilization, while it would create a large army, would take a very long time, because Russia was less well developed than France, and France was a close ally of Russia. So Germany determined to knock France out of the war first, so it could then deal with a slower mobilizing Russia. So Germany declared war on France, an ally of Russia, but to attack France was difficult, because the traditional frontier between Germany and France had a large number of fortifications going back to the period after the Franco-Prussian War and even before, fortifications like Metz. So the Germans decided to go through Belgium. Now, Belgium had a special status for the English. It contained the port of Antwerp, which is a very large port, and the British feared that any country that controlled Belgium would then be able to use the port to affect and mobilize naval forces against English interests in Europe. So the English were not very clear in their commitment in the crises leading up to the war that they would intervene on the behalf of Belgium. But this was their policy. And the British hadn't clearly communicated it because they didn't want to appear overly aggressive. But once German forces entered Belgium, the British promptly declared war on Germany, and this came as a shock to German diplomats. And so you have the main players involved in the war, all within a matter of weeks. On August 23rd, 1914, Japan joins the Allies and declares war on Germany and is able to then seize German possessions in China and the Marshall and Mariana Islands in the Pacific. And the Japanese then send a flotilla to the Mediterranean to help the Allies in escort duties. On October 1914, the Ottoman join Germany, primarily because they anticipate an attack by the English and the French. May 23rd, 1915, after remaining neutral, Italy, in effect, switches sides. It basically concludes it's able to profit more by being allied with France and England, who are going to give it territorial concessions, including Tyrol in what is Austria and Trieste in the Balkans. So it starts a war against Austria-Hungary. In late 1915, Bulgaria joins on the Central Power side, essentially to balance against French and English support for the Greeks. In summer of 1916, Romania joins the Allies, the Russians, and it was anticipating assistance from France. And then in April 1917, in response to unrestricted U-boat warfare by the Germans in the Atlantic and disruption to trade, and German attempts to mobilize Mexico against the U.S., which was then a source of instability on the U.S. border, the United States declares war against the Central Powers. So you can see at the beginning of the conflict, you had very rapid escalation because of an intertwining of alliances. And if the British, for example, had declared more aggressively their intent to declare war if any country passed through Belgium, it might have caused Germany to think twice about so quickly mobilizing to assist the Austro-Hungarians against the Russians. The Germans might have in fact restrained the Austro-Hungarians by alerting them to the fact that they were not then going to immediately leap to war. You can see here in the geography of the First World War, the Central Powers in the center, and the fact that Germany had no other allies. So they were heavily dependent on Austria-Hungary and consequently were a victim of whatever motives Austria-Hungary had for war. And following the assassination in Sarajevo, the Austro-Hungarian Empire felt an enormous threat to the legitimacy of this multi-ethnic empire, which, if it was not addressed, would have spread to the other groups within the empire and could have caused the empire to collapse. The prevailing military technology at the time was seen as offensive. This meant that if you didn't attack first, you would be defeated. This was principally because of the system of mobilization that was tied to a railway system. It would take just a couple of days to mobilize millions of soldiers. And once this mobilization process started, it would be difficult to stop because all the train movements were interlinked in a very complicated process. And if it was stopped, it would be difficult to restart. In other words, those that were involved in mobilization believed that the first state to be able to mobilize would have a huge first move advantage. This was analyzed in a book, War by Timetable, by well-known military historian A.J.P. Taylor. Here you can see trains loading up soldiers going to the front. Mobilization in World War I was probably faster than mobilization in Europe, in NATO, during the Cold War, and was probably faster than mobilization in the lead-up to the Second World War. It was an astronomically well-organized system all across Europe, but it made most of the major countries incredibly sensitive to being slow by not mobilizing quickly and initially. There were others who believed that the First World War was the result of an arms race which dated back to 1910, when you had a succession of disputes and crises, mainly between Germany, France, and Austria-Hungary and Russia, that led to a militarization of diplomacy. And eventually, one of these crises, when they occurred, an assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, ultimately led to war. As each dispute occurred, the states were increasingly willing to risk war in order to gain benefits. In other words, in order not to lose that particular dispute. So this we characterize by a game of chicken that we're going to look at later on in the course. Now, the term arms race itself is a journalistic term that was introduced into politics. But it gives the sense that in the industrial age, countries were building up weapons very quickly, and these were creating windows of opportunity. Because when you had a military advantage, you needed to use it, because if you didn't and you became weak, your opponent would then have the advantage, and then they would use their window of opportunity. And with every crisis, you had a militarization of diplomacy, because the civilian leaders would bring in a larger number and a greater proportion of advisors who were from the military, and fewer advisors that were professional diplomats. And military people don't necessarily want war as a class, although they train for it. What military people are sensitive to is being taken advantage of during a window of opportunity. So they will always advise to move first and quickly, rather than to move second and slowly. But in a system where all of the crisis leadership is being advised by the military to move first, you're very likely to have a rapid escalation once the dispute occurs, where all of the powers decide to act aggressively to protect their interests. There were a number of disputes that led up to the First World War, including the 1908 Bosnian crisis between Austria-Hungary and Russia, which then focused Austria-Hungary and Russia against each other for every subsequent dispute. In July of 1911, there was the Agadir incident in which the Germans dispatched the ship Panther to stake their diplomatic position in Morocco, and the French resisted, and with the help of their allies, Germany was ultimately pressured to leave. But this then sensitized Germany to the fact that the next time there was a crisis involving their ships and their interests, they would not back down. There then followed two crises in the Balkans that led to war, the First Balkan War and the Second Balkan War. The first was the rapid dismantling of the remnants of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, and the second was in a conflict between these Balkan powers that had replaced the Ottoman Empire. And these different countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece, picked different sides during the First World War. All of this contributed to the militarization and the hypersensitivity to the next crisis that would occur. And ultimately that crisis was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. A fourth cause of war, which was proposed by Lenin in his book Imperialism in 1917, argued that Germany was in fact an aggressive, capitalist, imperialist state. Both Germany and Italy had unified and industrialized very late, and so they missed out on lucrative colonial markets. And this therefore made them sensitive both to the fact that they didn't get their fair share of colonies to provide primary products for their markets, but also that they needed a navy to protect the colonies that they were able to get. Now, the principal evidence for this is that Germany entered the war right after it completed the Kiel Canal, which connected the Baltic to the North Sea. And it allowed Germany's fleet to travel between those two seas through Hamburg. Now, there is some evidence that the German government, even today, discourages research on its responsibility for the First World War. Now, more contemporary political economic research suggests that Germany's colonies produced very little useful economic output for Germany. Rather, Germany's colonies were a part of Weltpolitik, which is essentially a domestic propaganda campaign that was encouraged by the German Navy so that it could raise the funds necessary to build a very large fleet, a fleet large enough to challenge the British fleet. So even if it's not real that Germany was a capitalist state seeking colonies, it acted as if it were, and many Germans believed this to be true. There have been many other proposed causes of the First World War, including German militarism. The fact that you had a class of military people who were very confident, but at the same time, they could look over to the east and they could see that the Russians were involved in a rapid economic growth spurt, including industrialization. And that eventually, because of Russia's vast size, natural resources, and bigger population, it would eventually eclipse Germany's strength. Also, Germany's ally, Austria-Hungary, was slowly falling apart. Where Germany had unified German-speaking people into a single state, Austria-Hungary was falling apart because it had multilinguistic groups who wanted self-determination. They wanted to rule themselves. The Croats, the Slovenes, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Serbs, the Bosnians, and others. And even if all of those had achieved their independence, you still had the Austrians and the Hungarians. And it's probable that they would have parted their separate way as well and created their own state, as they ultimately did. Another major motive was domestic nationalism. Throughout the world, there had been a shift away from a common identity of Christendom ever since the 30 Years' War to identity based on language. And so people with different languages through their education system came to believe that they had exclusive histories. So people that spoke French had a French-speaking history. The people that spoke German had a common origin. And at the time, you had rapid class change as people moved from the countryside into the cities, and this caused a lot of social dislocation. And so many of the ideas pushed to keep society unified was nationalism, to explain a lot of the disruption that people were feeling in their lives, and to deal with the rise and the constant threat of class politics. When World War I did break out, people in almost every city celebrated that they could finally show that their culture, their identity, the French race, the German race, the English race, the Russian race, could finally demonstrate that theirs was the superior culture. Here you can see on the bottom left Canadian soldiers, many of whom were actually born in England, signing up eagerly to get into a fight. You had popular demonstrations supporting the war in Paris, London, Berlin, Moscow, Vienna, Budapest. As an exception, you can see the picture on the bottom right, which was in Montreal, where there was never much support in the war. And this is almost a peculiar situation on the Allied side at the beginning of the war. When the end of the First World War finally came, it did so because the German war effort collapsed domestically. The German people no longer supported the regime's military or political goals. And this led to the collapse of the monarchy in Germany. Nationalist tension split apart Austria-Hungary at the end of the war. Russia underwent a collapse of government and a communist revolution. The Ottoman Empire shattered into pieces and was briefly occupied before nationalist Turks were able to reassert territorial control of Asia Minor. The First World War was also an enormously costly enterprise. In order to win the war, the English and the French went heavily into debt. They sacrificed whatever credit power they had before the war. So to avoid any such repeat of such a disaster, the victors and the losers of the First World War supported the creation of the League of Nations, which was an international organization that would facilitate negotiation between the great powers to avoid the recurrence of a war on the scale of the First World War. So the League of Nations was proposed by the American president, Wilson, but ultimately, because of domestic politics in the US, which is tending towards isolationism after the scale of the First World War, didn't join the League of Nations. But a fundamental principle that the League of Nations pushed, as well as the peace negotiations after the First World War, was the idea of self-determination, the idea that people have a right to rule themselves. Now, this implied in the long term the end of colonialism. So colonialism was redefined as mandates. Regions of the world where European countries had a responsibility to bring modernization. But ultimately it meant it was the beginning of the end for the European empires because they had been delegitimized. Wilson's goal was also to make the world safe for democracy by getting rid of autocratic monarchical systems and pushing ideas of representative government. Now, ultimately, the League of Nations would be dissolved because it was discredited by its failure to arrest the increasingly aggressive fascist powers, particularly Japan in China and Italy in Ethiopia in the 1930s. Now you can see here represented on the bottom right the 14 points. These were points that President Wilson had published in his vision of a solution to never allowing the First World War to occur again. And included in there was the idea of the creation of the League of Nations. Now, the 1929 stock market crash, which was not unusual. There had been many market crashes in the European experience going back centuries, in fact. And economic depressions were also not unusual. The most recent Great Depression was in the 1870s. But the 1929 stock market crash created mass unemployment globally and with a shock that had not previously occurred. And it occurred at a time when, in the post-First World War environment, citizens were expecting for the first time that their government intervene to help them. And so this created political backlashes. In some countries like the United States, it led to the Democrats being elected and to the adoption of much more socialist policies, interventionist policies by the government, particularly in areas of employment. But in states with governments that could less easily provide services, like in Germany and Japan and Italy, it worsened class warfare and led to the rise and consolidation of radical parties, some of which had very aggressive foreign policies, including, as you can see depicted on the right, Benito Mussolini of Italy, who started off as a socialist newspaper editor and became a major political actor shortly after the First World War. As a consequence of the Great Depression, radical parties, particularly the National Socialist Deutschland Albeitung Party, the NSDAP, was able to seize control of Germany. Specifically, the German president Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And this allowed Hitler to take control of the German bureaucracy and then to reshape the entire state according to the goals of the Nazi Party. This led to German rearmament in 1935. The prevailing class divisions in France and general pacifism, because of the consequences of the destruction of the First World War, kept England and France from intervening militarily to stop the Germans from building an army beyond the 100,000 soldier limit that they were held to by the Treaty of Versailles. In 1936, the German army marched into the Rhineland, which was previously demilitarized. This is on the border region of France. And this gave Germany military control of industrial areas in the Ruhr heartland, which is the core of Germany's industrial area. And it gave Germany military control over one of the principal sources of coal, which was necessary for its factories to function. In 1938, German soldiers marched in and incorporated Austria into a greater Germany. And there then followed the Munich Crisis in September and October of 1938. This is a pivotal crisis because after this crisis, England and France were determined to stop any more concessions to Germany. But at this crisis, Hitler was able to get major advantages and extract benefits in the crisis with regard to the territories of Czechoslovakia. In international relations theory, the Munich Crisis is a lesson about how to interpret territorial expansion threats during a crisis. And this has affected virtually every aspect of crisis analysis, including brinkmanship, which is how states negotiate during a crisis. It influenced the Cuban Missile Crisis. It influenced the confrontation between the great powers during the Cold War. So the Munich Crisis broke out over the redrawing of the frontier between Germany and Czechoslovakia. There were 2.5 million Sudeten Germans living in Czechoslovakia, in territory which Hitler wanted to annex to Germany, following the principle of self-determination. This was the principle that US President Wilson had elaborated as the principle that would keep peace in Europe. So on that basis, it was very difficult to disagree with Adolf Hitler's demand. Hitler argued that Germans should have a right to live under a government of their own choosing. Now the problem was that handing over the territory where the Sudetens lived would have meant the Czechs would have had to give up their main defensive line, because the Sudeten Germans lived on mountains that essentially formed the border between Czechoslovakia and Germany. During the crisis, Hitler threatened to go to war if the Germans didn't receive this territory. But of course, the Czechs depended, because they were so small, on the French in order to resist the Germans. So the Czechs would have resisted if the French were there to support them. So there were negotiations between the French and the English and Adolf Hitler, and Mussolini of Italy was also there as an ally of Adolf Hitler, and these went from the 15th to the 28th of September in 1938. And they ultimately resulted in the September 29th Munich Agreement, in which England, France, and Italy permitted Germany to dismember Czechoslovakia and take over the Sudetenland. Beneš, who you can see at the top right, who is the Czechoslovakian premier, was excluded from the meeting. You can see in the bottom right, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, shaking hands with Adolf Hitler over the agreement. The public sentiment in France and England up to this point was not to go to war over Czechoslovakia. It wasn't a core British interest. The British wanted the Europeans on the mainland to solve their own diplomatic problems. They simply didn't want Europe to be unified. The French, without English support, were too divided and too weak to confront Germany and give support to Czechoslovakia. So effectively, Czechoslovakia was abandoned. Here you can see British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain coming off of his airplane in England and declaring to a crowd and to the radios, "Peace in our time." And he waved the Munich Agreement in the air to show that he had brought peace and avoided war. But within a year and a half, the Second World War broke out when the Germans invaded Poland with a similar ultimatum. So this policy has been called appeasement. Appeasement is where you basically give in to military expansionists. And it's seen as a bad policy. Now, Neville Chamberlain was not a bad prime minister. The British business of government was business. And while he was a politician, he came from a family of business people. These wealthy investors had interests all over the globe, not only in the British colonies, but in South America, in the United States. And they wanted the world to be at peace. They didn't profit from war. So they would do everything possible, desperately, to make sure that war didn't break out. But in their desperation, they didn't realize that they sent the wrong signal to state leaders that were looking to use war as a means of territorial expansion. So the lesson of the Munich Agreement was that appeasement as a policy was dangerous. Giving in to an aggressive leader is simply going to encourage the aggressive leader to make more demands later. In effect, that leader is insatiable. They cannot be satisfied. So the Munich Agreement has been an archetype of not giving in, of resisting, of standing up. And consequently, it's informed deterrence theory. Deterrence is the act of keeping another state from acting against yourself by the threat of punishment. An example would be Switzerland. Not a very large or powerful country, but it's got a military sufficiently big in a difficult mountainous environment that if anyone invaded it, it would inflict costs. Perhaps not enough to maintain its independence, but enough to not make it worthwhile to get conquered. Now, appeasement is not always wrong. Sometimes a leader has a legitimate claim. But the Munich Agreement has a warning that when you make a negotiation, be able to confirm that that leader is not going to then use your apparent weakness to extract more gains later on. And the Munich Agreement also occurred in a context of the 1930s, the context of strategic bombing. In the First World War, British and French bombers dropped bombs on German factories in the Ruhr. And German Zeppelins would drop bombs on London and cities in England. By the 1930s, Zeppelins had been replaced by large four-engined bombers that could fly up to 1,000 miles, carrying bombs that would explode, incendiaries that would burn magnesium at 3,000 degrees and burn down all sorts of wooden buildings and even burn through stone buildings, and gas bombs. And this was common to all major powers. It was believed that World War II would only last a week. The English would send their bombers over German cities. Within hours, Germany would send its bombers over English and French cities. And the combination of explosives, magnesium bombs, and gas bombs would push civilians to push their government for peace. And so this was the war that was avoided by Neville Chamberlain when he agreed to the Munich Agreement. Now, ultimately, World War II was not fought that way, but the negotiators didn't know it at the time. In order to deter aggressive states, according to deterrence theory, the threat of inflicting punishment must satisfy three necessary conditions. The first condition is that the state that is deterring have sufficient capability. For example, the British, in the lead up to the Falklands War, did not have more than 90 Royal Marines deployed in the Falkland Islands, what the Argentines call Las Malvinas. This, to the Argentinians, made the Falkland Islands look weak. Even though the British Navy and Army and Air Force were more powerful than Argentina, they were deployed thousands of kilometers away. So the Falkland Islands looked weak. The second necessary condition is credibility. The deterring state must be believed to be willing to use force. Now, in the 1973 October War, when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel, the Soviet Union had already alerted the frontline Arab states that Israel had a handful of nuclear weapons. But these nuclear weapons were not believed to be usable by the Egyptians or the Syrians. If Israel had used nuclear weapons, it would have led to an outcry, a possible economic embargo, and the end of the Israeli state. So Israel had nuclear weapons, but they were not usable, except to get diplomatic leverage, perhaps, from allies. The third requirement is communication. You have to communicate your threat. It was alleged in the lead up to Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, that he had a conversation with American ambassador April Glaspie. And he told Glaspie that Iraq has a problem with Kuwait because Iraq can't repay the debts because it borrowed money from Kuwait to fight the war. It had a dispute with Kuwait over the use of a common oil field. And so Saddam Hussein would like to take measures to deal with Kuwait. And April Glaspie said the United States takes no particular interest in the relations between Iraq and Kuwait. And Saddam Hussein interpreted this as a green light from the United States permitting Iraq to invade Kuwait. But April Glaspie had also stated, and we have the transcript, that the negotiations between Iraq and Kuwait should occur within the context of U.S. interests in the region. And this was a restrained American way of saying, we have interests, and if you violate those interests, you will be punished. But April Glaspie was not emphasizing this point because she couldn't possibly have imagined that Saddam Hussein could misinterpret something so fundamental. And Saddam Hussein misinterpreted it, invaded Kuwait, and then was destroyed in a counterattack. The consequence of the rise of radical fascist parties in Europe was the outbreak of the Second World War, which killed more people than any other previous interstate conflict. The war in Europe created an opportunity for Japan to accelerate its attempted conquest of China, which, when it got stuck because of British and American and Russian assistance to the Chinese, led the Japanese ultimately to their attack on Pearl Harbor against the United States. The conclusion of the Second World War and the devastation it spread in Europe and East Asia left the Soviet Union and the United States as the two largest military and economic powers in the world. The Cold War itself started with the Soviet Union's military occupation of Central Europe and its failure to follow through on its promise to allow free and fair elections. This culminated in the 1948 Berlin crisis, in which the Soviets blockaded the city, leading the English and the Americans to have an air ferry bringing food to feed the population. There were calls in the United States to roll back communism. However, Western Europe was severely damaged by the Second World War, and the US population itself would not support a second large-scale conflict. George F. Kennan argued that the safest and most effective strategy to deal with the Soviet Union was to isolate it economically, diplomatically, and surround it with friendly alliances, and to simply wait for it to undergo inevitable social change. A middle class would emerge, created through the normal process of industrialization and development, that on its own would overthrow communism. Kennan expressed his strategy in the Long Telegram while working in Moscow in 1946. His strategy first appeared in 1988, when Chinese communist students in Tiananmen rose up against what they perceived to be institutional corruption. And then it spread to the Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern and Central Europe: Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, when communism started to dismantle itself. And ultimately, it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, not every war during the Cold War was directly related to the confrontation. But due to Soviet sponsorship, there were a great many wars that occurred on the different continents. George F. Kennan took a principled position to stand up to the spread of communism, but not for the United States to get involved in every conflict on the planet. Now, the Cold War itself started with the Greek Civil War in 1944 and ultimately ended with the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. You can see in the top right a map of the starting positions at the beginning of the Cold War. The countries in red are the communist countries, or countries that would ultimately be invaded or support communist countries. So you have China, which became communist after its civil war in 1949. The dark blue countries are the primary Western countries and members of NATO. The light blue countries are their allied countries, like Japan, Australia, Ethiopia, Spain. The green countries are as yet not independent colonies. So between 1945 and 1953, you have a crisis in Iran where the Soviet Union is essentially threatened if it didn't leave northern Iran. The Berlin Crisis of 1948. You have the Chinese Revolution of 1949, which was a severe wake-up call in the United States to the threat of communism. And you have the breakout of the Korean War in 1950 when North Korea invades South Korea, and the United States and the United Nations got involved. There followed the Suez Crisis of 1956, which had political implications because it involved Israel and the frontline Arab states in the Cold War. There was a revolt by the Hungarians against Soviet occupation in 1956, which basically outlined that because of the Soviet nuclear deterrent, the Western countries were not willing to start a war to liberate Central Europe. The French were defeated in their colonial war in Vietnam in 1954. Again, it didn't imply immediate Cold War impact, except that the Chinese and the Soviet Union had supported the Viet Minh against the French. There were two Taiwan Strait crises, 1954 and 1958, in which China tried to use force to capture Taiwan. There was the Sino-Indian War of 1962, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis between the United States and the Soviet Union over Cuba. There was the Confrontazi in 1963, in which a communist sympathetic Indonesia was trying to capture former British colonies, and the beginning of American involvement in Vietnam in 1965, and the Six-Day Arab-Israeli War of 1967, and the Sino-Soviet clash of 1969, and the Indo-Pakistan War of 1971, and the Arab-Israeli War in October of 1973. And there followed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, a Sino-Vietnamese border war in 1979, and then the U.S. invasion of Grenada in 1983 and of Libya being bombed by the U.S. in 1986. And so these are the major events and conflicts of the Cold War, ones in which the U.S. and the Soviet Union were relatively heavily invested. And there are many other conflicts in which they were less heavily invested, particularly in Africa, and conflicts in Central America, like the Guerra de Football between El Salvador and Honduras, which did not have a Cold War implication. This was the main geography of confrontation during the Cold War. You had large numbers of missile and bomber bases in the Soviet Union and the United States and across the world. And if there was going to be a nuclear war, it would have been fought over the North Pole. Bombers and missiles would have flown over Canada in both directions, and some landing and targeting in Canada. So this was going to be the battlefield. And it would have taken about 45 minutes for a missile to go from its silo or base in one country and then to strike its target in the other country. One of the big questions about the Cold War was why there was never a nuclear exchange. And there are two essential explanations. The first is there was effective deterrence by nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons had changed the game. They had raised the costs of war to such a level it wasn't rational, based on the possible benefits of war, for either side to start a conflict, even for the revolutionary Soviet Union. A second explanation is the obsolescence of war. Even if nuclear weapons had never come into existence, some scholars argue peace would have prevailed anyway. War had simply become obsolete, just like dueling or slavery in the previous century. The tremendous cost of the Second World War, on top of the tremendous cost of the First World War, simply alienated war for most members of the middle class. Small wars were still possible, but war between major powers, even if they were only conventional, would have produced catastrophic devastation even in the absence of nuclear weapons. The most consequential crisis event of the Cold War and possibly the most important crisis for the purposes of learning is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Far more important than the Munich Crisis. The US held a nuclear monopoly from 1945 to 1949 when the Soviet Union detonated its own fission device. By 1960, the US had a huge advantage in bombers able to reach the Soviet Union, with the result that if there were a nuclear war, the Soviet Union could probably easily devastate Europe, and possibly even conquer Europe. But it couldn't reach the US except with a small handful of bombers, most of which were not going to survive the flight. To address this imbalance, and to protect the Soviet Union against US nuclear threats, Soviet Secretary General Nikita Khrushchev implemented a plan to secretly deploy missiles to Cuba. So the Soviet Union had rocket technology, but it wasn't long-range rocket technology. So the Soviet Union needed a base in which to deploy their nuclear weapons. There was a revolution in Cuba in 1959 that had led to the installation of communist leader Fidel Castro, and he invited the Soviet Union to deploy their military forces on the island as a way of ensuring that the US didn't invade Cuba. Because there had been a CIA operation, the Bay of Pigs, which had failed, which indicated to Fidel Castro that the US had intent eventually to overthrow his government. So you can see here on the map, Cuba in the middle left on the west of the map, located right off the southern coast of Florida, which allowed short-range Soviet missiles to then reach most of the southeast of the United States. And so this allowed the Soviet Union to quickly put the US under the range of Soviet missiles. So the Soviet Union could deter against the US if the US acted militarily against Soviet interests. So the Cuban Missile Crisis began on October 22, 1962, when US President Kennedy announced that the Soviet Union had installed intermediate-range missiles on Cuba with the capability of hitting the southeastern United States. The significance of the crisis is that it was the closest the Cold War superpowers, the US and the USSR, ever came to a direct conflict and to a direct nuclear conflict. And it taught the leaders of both sides important lessons in restraint. And this realization would result in a loosening of the intensity of the Cold War. And this would last until the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. You can see on the map in the center where the missiles were deployed in the western sections of Cuba and the US blockade against Soviet shipping coming to Cuba. You can see on the bottom right a classified document showing the US estimated range of the SS-5 and the SS-4 in the southeast US. And you can see an SS-5 missile now at a museum in the top right. This is a typical reconnaissance photo, one of a great many taken by high-flying US U-2 aircraft that took pictures of the facilities where the Soviets were deploying secretly their missiles. Later, the US sent low-level reconnaissance aircraft. One US pilot, Anderson, was shot down and killed while conducting reconnaissance. And this could have triggered an escalation of the crisis. In 1959, the Cuban communist leader Fidel Castro successfully led a revolution, ousting the pro-US Batista regime, and he invited in Soviet economic and military assistance to guarantee the safety of his new government. On April 15th to 20th, 1961, the US unsuccessfully sponsored an invasion of Cuba with Cuban exiles in what came to be known as the Bay of Pigs incident. You can see in the bottom right a depiction of the communist counterattack against the exiles after their landing on the beach. So the Soviet Union began deploying its forces, including missiles, at the beginning of September of 1962, with the goal of having missiles ready by late October. But before the missiles became operational, they were detected by the United States, which triggered the crisis. On October 23rd, the United States complained to the United Nations and the Organization of American States and implemented a naval quarantine of Cuba, which immediately triggered a Soviet military alert challenging the blockade. The US then began preparations for airstrikes against the missile sites and for a conventional invasion of Cuba to remove the missiles. Between October 24th and 29th, the US and the Soviet Union were on the verge of nuclear war, when ultimately Khrushchev backed down after the US pledged not to invade Cuba. On November 2nd, 1962, the quarantine was lifted when the Soviet Union withdrew missiles from Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis is of particular interest to theorists of international relations because US President Kennedy managed the crisis through the Executive Committee, which was an elite committee of military and political advisors. Kennedy was heavily influenced by Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August, a book which described the causes of the First World War, particularly the poor decisions made by the military and political leaders leading up to the First World War. Kennedy therefore spent a great deal of effort to ensure clear and credible, but not provocative, communication with the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis has therefore been studied as the best practices in crisis management. In an age when nuclear weapons can inflict enormous damage, there is a premium placed on successfully negotiating a resolution of a crisis to avoid a large-scale nuclear war. New economic institutions. The widespread belief by Western policymakers that the Great Depression caused the Second World War led to the creation of a system of international organizations that were intended to ensure economic development promoting peace after the war was concluded. There resulted two classes of international institutions: the United Nations and its associated agencies, and a constellation of economic institutions designed to facilitate the liberalization of trade and development. After the failure of the League of Nations, the United Nations came into effect with 29 members on October 24th, 1945. It had 5 permanent members: the US, the Soviet Union, China, France, and England. The Concert of Europe was the model that many hoped the United Nations would become, a place for the great powers to coordinate their actions. The Concert of Europe, which we will discuss later, was an international diplomatic regime set up by the victors after the defeat of Napoleon to suppress the reemergence of revolution in Europe. Now, the logic behind the United Nations Security Council veto system, while it's not fair in a universalist sense, because of the many smaller states in the United Nations, is that it is a mechanism for facilitating consensus among the leading powers. The United Nations cannot act without all of the veto powers agreeing to the common policy. The 5 veto powers remain the only states capable of mass-producing thermonuclear weapons, which is the decisive instrument of a great power. Now, the veto system compels the Security Council members to compromise their interests and, in some instances, to engage in vote trading. For example, the People's Republic of China did not veto the U.S. involvement during Operation Desert Storm in 1991 in exchange for relaxing some of the Western sanctions from the Tiananmen Square episode in 1988. Likewise, the Soviet Union did not veto the U.S., and in exchange, the U.S. did not criticize the bloody crackdown by the Soviet Interior Ministry troops in the Baltic states, specifically the use of tanks for crowd control in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The international economic institutions included the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. Their principal goal was to avert a return to the disastrous depression of the 1930s, and thereby to avert its political consequences, the creation of radical parties motivated by unemployment. These institutions were grounded on the Bretton Woods Agreement signed in 1944 that facilitated currency transfers to facilitate trade. The World Bank was inaugurated by Bretton Woods, and its principal goal was to implement development in the developing world, especially the states that were devastated by the Second World War, as well as countries that were becoming independent from colonialism. The World Trade Organization was originally the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, signed in 1947, which was periodically renegotiated, and it sought the controlled reduction of tariffs between most of the world states in order to achieve free trade. These economic organizations were grounded on the assumption that peace could be facilitated by having states make trade rather than war, and increasing general prosperity so that middle classes could be formed to support democracy. It was also widely believed that these international organizations depended for their support on the power of the United States. When the U.S. fell into relative economic decline in the 1970s, due mainly to the recovery of European economies and Japan since the end of the Second World War, there was widespread fear that these regimes and institutions would collapse with it. However, these organizations began to take on a life of their own. They no longer depended on the U.S. for their existence. European integration, and perhaps eventual unification, is one of those great processes that conventional international relations theory has a great deal of difficulty explaining. Normally, under realism, which is an approach in international relations you'll learn more about later, states should want to seek to survive and don't typically negotiate away their independence in order to join a larger quasi-state. Karl Deutsch proposed 6 background conditions for successful integration. The first was social interaction among the members. 2, a balance of flows, both economic, media, and workers. 3, benefits of cooperation. In essence, a structure where you had comparative advantage between the members. 4, a norm against war between the members. 5, a decline of political divisions. And importantly, 6, an external challenge, which for European integration was the military and ideological threat of Soviet expansion. You can see in the cartoon in the bottom right, one of the implications has to do with identity. Turkey has been trying to join the European Union for decades, and despite constant discussions and requirements proposed by the European Union, Turkey never seems to satisfy the requirements sufficiently. And one of the explanations is that the European Union is essentially a replication of Christendom, having to do with a broad European identity. And states that don't share the identity, even if they share every other condition, including economic and structural, are not invited. Now, European integration is not unique. There have been a number of unsuccessful and successful attempts. Of course, the original 13 states in North America that ultimately created the United States. Scotland and England in 1707. Wales and England in 1536. The Union of Zurich, Bern, and the Swiss cantons of 1848. The Confederation of the North German states. The Union of Italy in 1859 to 1860. The Union of the German Empire in 1871. England in 1066. And more recently, Yemen. There have also been unsuccessful attempts at integration. Sweden and Norway broke up in 1905. Habsburg Austria-Hungary broke up at the end of the First World War. Ireland and England broke up in 1921. Syria and Egypt, as a part of the United Arab Republic, collapsed. Attempts by the Ba'ath Party to unite Syria and Iraq failed. There are a number of cases that are difficult to judge because they're still in progress. There is, of course, the integration of Hong Kong and Macau into mainland China. The integration of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip and Israel. The integration of Cyprus and Turkey. And the integration of Western Sahara into Morocco. Well, we're living in an age where you have continued decline of Western dominance from the starting point of Albuquerque's intervention in the Indian Ocean. Although European states began their relative decline at the end of the First World War, decolonization did not become realized until the greater disruption that followed the Second World War, particularly Japan's occupation of European colonies in the Far East. India and Pakistan became independent in 1947, accompanied by many states in the Middle East, followed by much of Southeast Asia and Africa in the 1960s. Some quasi-colonial regimes in Rhodesia and the Republic of South Africa held out until 1980 and 1993, respectively. You can see in the soccer ball shaped diagram the distribution of wealth among Western states, the Europeans in green, North Americans in pink, Asia in blue, Latin America in brown, the Middle East in dark green, and Africa in purple, and Oceania in red. And you can also see in the map on the right, the world in 1945. Blue are independent countries and red are colonies. Although much of the developing world, and certainly shortly after decolonization, were originally united in the non-aligned movement, which opposed both superpower blocs. With time, memory of the colonial era faded, and many of the states have since adopted more regionally oriented nationalist foreign policies. Now you can see a meeting of the non-aligned movement in the picture of the five gentlemen in the top right, some of whom are Sukarno of Indonesia, Nasser of Egypt, and Nehru of India, and I believe that's Nkrumah. And you can see the non-alignment movement member states at the bottom, and those are the current members today. Although the organization today has little political impact. Now, whereas some developing countries continue to do poorly economically and generally blame patterns of international capitalism originating in the core developed states, in other words, the former colonial powers, this theory is called dependency theory. Others, such as the oil-rich Middle Eastern states, and especially states in the Far East and some in Latin America, have gone a long way to advancing their economic well-being. So we're going to look at dependency theory later on in the course. One of the great failures of international relations theory was the failure to predict the end of the Cold War. Although George F. Kennan had given us the outlines of containment theory, and he gave us a description of what victory would look like, political science failed in its ability to predict when the Soviet Union would collapse and when the Cold War would end. There were some authors of best-selling books that predicted that Soviet communism would last until 2030. Ultimately, the Soviet Union collapsed 40 years earlier. And so it's one of the lingering debates. Why did the Cold War end? The conventional wisdom has been that the Soviet Union became weak and simply collapsed. In the past, however, states in decline like Austria-Hungary eventually embarked on war, but the Soviet Union didn't. So we have here a possible explanation which comes from the influence of what's called an epistemic community, a group of specialists in the arms control practice. So during the Cold War in Central Europe, there was considerable pressure within NATO to negotiate arms control with the Soviet Union. The logic was that there could be some mutual increases in security by having a mutual reduction in the probability of accidental or unintended war. This intention by the NATO countries was captured in the 1967 Harmel report, and it was a major factor in the negotiations that took place in direct bilateral exchanges between the US and the Soviet Union through the auspices of the CSCE, the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe. To make a long story short, the arms control interaction is credited by some academics with having hastened the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. See, in the late 1970s, the US was concerned with the massive buildup in military equipment in Central Europe, and along with its European allies, attempted to influence the Soviet Union into a more restrained posture. Arms control ideas themselves came out of a complex debate in the late 1950s and 1960s, particularly as the US had to redesign strategies around the fact that they no longer possessed nuclear superiority, and that conventional weapons seemingly still had a place in limited conflict. Now, the objective of arms control is the enhancement of mutual security, making countries be more safe, by affecting the number and the nature of weapons. The logic is that some weapons, for example, make war more or less likely. Some weapons have a use it or lose it dilemma that makes them very likely to end up getting used in a crisis, so that users of these weapons may feel compelled to launch them. So for years, there was little progress until the early 1980s, when it became apparent that the Soviets were falling behind the US in high technology military weapons. The immediate consequence was for the Soviet Union to redress the imbalance. And it was not to buy into the arms control logic. But as a consequence of the US and the West interacting on arms control proposals, the Soviet Union began to internalize and learn these Western concepts and ideas about arms control. And they eventually became widely known in the Soviet Foreign Service. When Soviet Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he was a reformer intent on saving and fixing communism. He was an open thinker and eager to learn new ideas. His advisors were well versed in arms control policy and had come to make Gorbachev believe that the Soviet Union could considerably reduce its military investments without adversely affecting its security. Now, Gorbachev didn't believe these ideas immediately or automatically. He escalated the war in Afghanistan. He pushed considerable efforts for the Soviets to redouble their traditional communist practices of central planning. And when these had failed, when the war in Afghanistan was going poorly, when the Soviet economy still was not improving, he decided to invest in savings. And so he renegotiated with the West to reduce the number of weapons, to scale back the confrontation in the Cold War, to give the Soviet Union time and space and money to fix itself, that led to the rapid de-escalation of the Cold War. The key actor here is the epistemic community of arms control specialists in Europe, in the US, and the Soviet Union that engaged in a constant dialogue that led to the education of the Soviet arms control community, the Soviet Foreign Service, and ultimately the Soviet leader. And it was this de-escalation that started the process, that gave space for middle classes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to ultimately end the Cold War. And they also ended the Soviet Union. Democracy has been spreading inexorably, but there are times when democracies fall and return to a state of autocratic government. The first wave of democracy followed the end of the First World War, the collapse of Central and Eastern European empires that led to the first democracies. Most of these democracies were swept away by the Great Depression, when the governments could no longer perform and deal with the problems of unemployment. The second wave of democratization occurred during decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s. New Asian, Middle Eastern, and African countries embraced democracy. But soon there too, economic problems toppled democratic regimes with military coups and one-party states and other hybrid authoritarian systems. When the Cold War ended, you had the third wave of democracy. But even then, a few states had their regimes changed through military coups. In Pakistan, in Thailand, for example. But every time democracy spreads, it spreads more democracy than previously. And it looks like it's a general trend. This was analyzed by Samuel Huntington, depicted here. And the long-term trend is that as middle classes are created across the planet, democracy will ultimately become the only form of government in the world. An implication of this, because democracies don't fight each other, is we will have the democratic peace. Because democracies don't go to war against each other. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US has been the largest economic and military power in the world. US strategy with regard to the Eurasian continent remains the same as England's with regard to Europe, to oppose any consolidation of the continent under a single power, whether German, Japanese, Soviet, or Chinese. And this has left a number of theoretical questions. First, how long will the US last as the global hegemon, especially with the rise of China? England was a hegemon for about 100 years when they replaced the Dutch, from 1700 until about 1800. And then the American Revolution took away England's wealthiest colony. But then, with industrialization, the British reinvented themselves and became a power for another century. is the U.S. able to reinvent themselves? And the second question is, can it keep from attracting coalitions of other states from balancing against it? And the answer seems to be yes. China is reasonably unfriendly with U.S. hegemony. So is Russia. So are a number of minor states like Cuba and middle powers like Iran and North Korea. Yet so far, we haven't seen a large coalition counterbalancing the U.S. This we call the unipolar moment. It may not last forever, especially if the U.S. doesn't remain the largest economic and military power. But it is curious that we don't see a large formation of counterbalancing alliances against the U.S. And it's possibly because the U.S. is a liberal, democratic, capitalist trading state, and therefore wins allies much more easily than the countervailing autocratic states that are unfriendly to the U.S.